All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is the last session before the reception, and we promise to pack a lot of information in here. Plenty to give you some cocktail chatter. So as I said, we have a very full agenda today. My name is Christy Keene. I'm co-chair for Finance Audit and Costing Committee and Senior Director of Research Finance at the University of Chicago. I will pass it along to my colleagues to introduce themselves.
So, Melissa Korf, I am Senior Director for Research Contracts, Data, and Security at Harvard Medical School, and I also co-chair the Research Compliance Committee and this FAIR pilot with Jim and Michelle and Christy.
Hi, I'm Heather Bayshore from the National Cancer Institute's Office of Data Sharing.
We were told to not use acronyms, so I'm Valerie Clayton from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which is one of the 24 to 27 institutes at the NIH and our Office of Data Science and Sharing.
Oops. Hi, my name is Emily Boja, and I'm also from the National Cancer Institute Office of Data Sharing, and we're part of this pilot.
Have you introduced yourself yet today, Michelle?
Michelle.
Very good. And Jim Luther. Thank you.
And Kristen Toth.
Yes. We're really honored to be joined today by our NIH colleagues that have been so instrumental and active in this pilot. We wouldn't be here without all of your support. So we'll go, next slide. If we can, we'll just do a brief background on the pilot, and then we'll hand it off for the headlines, which is the NCI and NICHG observations, which I think everyone will be anxious to hear. We'll talk a little bit about what's next, and then if there is any time remaining, we will have a quick discussion. So let's talk about the background. For those that maybe are new to FDP this year, just a brief background how we got to where we are today, which is under the new NIH policy for data management and sharing. Each institute and center had the flexibility to develop more specific requirements to best meet the needs in their particular fields. However, that could lead to significant variation in the requirements, and as we know, we want to reduce administrative burden. So the pilot kind of came to fruition to reduce that burden, and the primary goal was to generate greater consistency in the DMS plan requirements across all ICs and programs, and to mitigate the administrative burden for researchers associated with the DMS plan development and implementation. So that's how we got here. In the pilot, we have broken it up into more than one phase. Phase one has been the focus on the templates, where we developed two templates, Alpha and Bravo. Alpha being a little bit more prescriptive, the SMART form that many of you have expressed that didn't quite work at your institution, but it gave the opportunity for more limited entry, kind of limited your free text. Whereas Bravo was kind of a hybrid between Alpha and the sample template, or the sample format, where you had some flexibility to enter free text. So along the way, throughout the pilot over the last year, we have gathered feedback from researchers and from our NIH colleagues to hear what's working, what isn't, what can be improved. So that's phase one. And we are very grateful to our phase one participants. Listed here, they've been very responsive to joining us at roundtables and town halls and sharing their experiences. They're doing that through a survey, and then we're sharing that feedback in these town halls and with our colleagues. So thank you to all of our participants. And now I will hand it off to our NCI colleagues to share their observations throughout the pilot.
Which button do I push?
obviously the big green button. Okay, I can handle this. So I just wanted to start off by thanking you all for your attention at the end of the day. Thank you for being here. I hope that it means that you have a lot of good feedback for us. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this, especially because some of what I'm going to talk about we did actually discuss at an FDP call in December. So you may have seen some of this before. But as I mentioned, I'm from the National Cancer Institute's Office of Data Sharing. And I just want to give a quick overview of kind of the scale of what we are looking at NCI. So at any given time, the National Cancer Institute is overseeing approximately 10,000 research grants, so a fairly large workload. We have hundreds of program officers, thousands of grants. And what you can see on the screen here is what we look at as kind of the arc of what is possible as far as free range versus really prescriptive data management and sharing plans. And we feel that we are, somewhere on the smaller end of the error right now, where, we have our data management and sharing policy, and really a lot of what we ask for in response is free text. We ask you to interpret what the policy says and tell us how you're going to comply with it. Really so glad to be part of this FDP initiative, where we can kind of get to a place where you still have that freedom to be making the decisions as far as how you're going to manage your data, but we're helping you understand what the policy is looking for and how we're getting closer to those fair data sharing principles that really underlie the point of the policy. Right up front, I just wanted to say that within the slide deck that you received from us, there are some resources that you can take home and share with your friends. Lots of different formats of finding information, from sort of long text blog style descriptions to decision trees, flow charts, FAQs, everything along the way. These are not all materials that are developed for cancer research, so some of these are NIH-wide, some of them are cancer-specific, so please feel free to share this slide with your colleagues who could benefit from some more information describing the DMS plan, the DMS policy, and how to write a DMS plan. So what we did within our office, and one thing that I forgot to mention, with our hundreds of program officers and thousands of grants, is that within the National Cancer Institute, we do not have a centralized mechanism for reviewing the DMS plans. So as you're probably aware, the DMS plans are only reviewed by the program staff. They're not generally subject to peer review. There are certain cases where they are, but in most cases, these are not part of the grant that goes under peer review. So acceptance of the plan is really the role of the program officer who is reviewing that grant. And in the NCI, we do not have a centralized office that's doing those reviews. All of our program officers are reviewing those DMS plans. So what we decided to do within the Office of Data Sharing was to do kind of a spot check. And this wasn't really, to call anybody out for what was going wrong. We just wanted to understand what is really happening out there with kind of a systematic review. So we developed a tool that program officers can use as kind of an assistive, I don't want to use the word checklist, that has like a connotation in our world, but kind of an assistive tool to look for different aspects of a DMS plan. And so we pulled down some plans within the first year of the policy being active that had, the grants had gone under peer review and were likely to be funded. So we pulled out just the DMS plans to take a look at, element by element of the policy. How did this plan do in addressing that element? So we reviewed just over 101, so I could say just over 100. We reviewed 100 DMS plans. I'm going to go through this really quickly because this is now kind of old news. We are in the process of doing this for year 2 to see if there are areas where things may have changed as far as the areas of greatest need. You can see on the screen the activity codes. So by and large, these were R awards, mostly R01s, as you might expect. But we wanted to try and get a feel for differences in the grant types as far as the data management and sharing plans. So I'm going to go through each element, again, really quickly, not going to go through everything that's on the slides. People did a really good job talking about the types of data that they would be collecting in their grant. You can see on screen that we actually captured those categories. So not surprisingly, for cancer research, a lot of genomic data, a lot of basic science, and then a fair amount of imaging and other clinical data, and other data types as well. And one of the things that we noticed, though, is that it's actually pretty rare. This is not like a big aha moment, but it's pretty rare for one grant to have one data type for the entire grant, right? So what that means when you're writing a plan is that you need to have a way of saying, for this data type, I'm going to deal with data management and sharing this way. For my second type of data, I'm going to deal with it this way, and so on. And in a free text narrative format, that can be really hard to write, and it can be really hard to follow. So that was our observation for that element. The second element of the policy talks about tools, software, and code. Out of the 100 or so that we looked at, 79 of them listed the names of tools. The rest of them either said there were no tools that would be needed, which we questioned, or just skipped the question entirely. It wasn't included in their textual response, so we noted this as an area where education could be needed. We were also interested to look at the A in FAIR, right? So accessibility of the data that is shared. So we looked at whether they were, the applicants were recommending tools that are free of cost for a secondary user. And we're a little bit surprised to see that while at least half of the plans did describe tools that were free, by and large, they also had some that were not free, or all of the tools they described were not free. So kind of meets the letter of the law, right? You're sharing the data, but the spirit is that those data would then be accessible really broadly, and if someone would need to purchase software or tools to access or use it, that's not getting all the way to what we're looking for. So that was just an observation, not something that we rate the plans on. The third element is standards. So I could talk for hours about standards. There are many groups, government groups, nonprofit groups, groups all over the place looking at standards. This is that I in FAIR, right? So interoperability all depends on how the data are recorded, the syntax, the column headers, whatever you want to call it, that can make two data sets line up. It's an area where we recognize there's not a lot of understanding. So about 2/3 of the plans we looked at described standards. The rest of them, again, either skipped it or misunderstood the question. And so, we found that this is definitely an area of need, not only to give some education about what we mean by standards, but to also really promote the use of standards to reach those FAIR elements. The fourth element of the policy is the really big, complicated one where it asks you for a bunch of things, name the repositories, tell us how they'll be findable and accessible, and tell us about the timeline. The policy wants the data to be available by the end of the award or at the time of publication, whichever comes first. And so we really wanted to know, how are people doing with this? So I don't know if you can see the little chart there where it's, I don't know if I have a pointer, but the little table there with the check marks, about half of them hit both of those marks, the rest of them hit one or the other or none. So this is a huge area of need and an area that we've discussed with our working group quite a bit, that, this is one of those questions where maybe if there's a right answer, we shouldn't ask you to guess on it. That's just my 2 cents, though, not speaking on behalf of anyone else. Our fifth element and sixth elements, I know there's a lot of folks in the room who have to do with regulatory and compliance, so you'll be pleased to know that our applicants really did pretty well with these two elements. Element 5 applies mostly, although not exclusively, to human subjects research. So the human subjects research protections were really well defined in those applications. And then element 6 asks who is going to have oversight for compliance with the plan. Again, people did pretty well answering that. Also, just for our own interest, we wanted to know who is it that they're naming, and by and large, they were naming the investigator as having that responsibility for oversight, which we thought was interesting. So Overall, about 60% of what we evaluated we thought would be pretty good to go without modification. Another 30% needed some modification, although of course I don't need to tell you guys in the room that any amount of modification is burden, right? So that's burden that we're trying to reduce. And 10% of the plans really needed quite a bit of revision in order to meet the policy expectations. We checked with some of our divisions within NCI to see if our findings were lining up with what they were seeing, and at least one of our divisions came back and said that they had approved about 65% of the plans that came in. So we felt like our assessment was going pretty well. I know this one is small, sorry. So, I mean, I won't read all of our observations, but generally of great interest to FDP, we did record in our data whether it was clearly use of a template or clearly free text. Those that were clearly free text, 0 of them were in that 60% that passed. So using a template is something that we support. And then, oh, sorry, did you want me to go back to that? We had a lot of other findings. There's a lot of other good observations that we made in here, but I want to make sure we have time for our questions and discussion. But one of the other things that we decided to take a look at is the genomic data sharing policy, the GDS, because this is an area that we started to hear from our program staff was causing a lot of problems, because those investigators who were used to working with the genomic data sharing policy were now being told they only needed to submit one data sharing plan, which is good, but you have to sort of merge these two policies together and make sure that you're addressing all of those pieces and no longer able to use a templated genomic data sharing plan, which made things really hard for the reviewers, because if you're familiar with the GDS, there are lots of different elements, lots of different benchmarks that have to be met. And it's just a much more complicated policy to tell if you need to adhere to it and also if you are adhering to it. So we took a look at those plans within our subset that we were looking at that had indicated that they were collecting genomic data. And we wanted to take a look at them and say, if they're collecting genomic data, are they subject to GDS? And if they should be subject to GDS, are they checking all of the boxes? And I'm also sharing on screen one of the links that we shared is this decision tree that our office, and I'll point to Emily, put together a really nice tool to help your investigators know, how to harmonize these two policies. And so of those that we thought had some genomic data, we felt that 63% of those should be subject to GDS, and of those 57 plans, again, that had genomic data, only 22% actually used the words genomic data sharing within their DMS plan. And so that would be a real quick takeaway, is that if you are writing your plan to adhere to the GDS policy and you tell us you're doing that, that helps us out quite a lot. And that was pretty rare. And so the timelines for sharing, according to GDS, are a little bit different from the DMS policy. So we took a look at whether the investigators who should be meeting those timelines were. That was a little bit better. About 83% actually were meeting those timelines. And then one of the other elements that's required by genomic data sharing policy is submission of an institutional certification, which I'm seeing some nodding that you're familiar with. And so we looked for whether that was actually attached with the grant submission, or if at least it was mentioned that it would be provided at just in time, and only 10 of those that should have had it actually did. So lots of work to do on GDS. We also looked at the repositories. By and large, they were using the repositories that were required by that policy. And there were various reasons for any exception to that. So some of the major pain points, again, even for our office to tell if that genomic data sharing policy should apply, a lot of times we had to just go back to the actual grant application. And the data management and sharing plan is intended to be written as a standalone document. So that's something that could cause some problems for investigators if you have to go back into the grant to find out the information. Again, they're not calling out the GDS particularly. And the timelines are a little bit tricky. So we definitely wanted to bring that information back to our working group because it was something that we were hearing from program staff that this is creating added difficulty in work. So I'm going to pass it on to Valerie, and then I think after that we'll take questions for NIH, right?
Awesome. Thank you. The big green button. All right. Thank you, Heather. Again, I'm from NICHD. That's the short name for my institute. I'm the Deputy Director of our Office of Data Science and Sharing, and I'm going to share some of our findings from and tips for data management and sharing plans. I always like to start by emphasizing, maybe I'll use the word NICHD is obsessed with data sharing. We really care passionately about it because we see how critical it is to accelerating research to improve the lives of our populations, which are children, pregnant and lactating people, and people with disabilities. Our office is charged with creating a data ecosystem that fosters responsible and innovative use of our data, and we couldn't do that without the data management sharing policy. We also don't have our own data sharing policy. We are just adopting the NIH policy as written. This is a summary of the approach we took. I'm not going to share numbers. I'll just go ahead and share themes. But in 2023, we pulled out a subset of data management and sharing plans from our portfolio and their associated data management and sharing budget justifications. We looked at those carefully and dug up these key issues and areas of confusion, brought those to our internal data sharing committee, and debated until we got to a point where we agreed on what was acceptable or not. We also, in parallel, did a portfolio analysis where we identified all the data repositories being named in our data management and sharing plans. And we used the lessons learned from all those activities to create and refine both public and internal resources and to train program staff. Recently, we've shifted our focus to spot checking plans that are already approved, plans that made it through the program officer and are part of awarded grants. And spoiler alert, we're still seeing those issues leak through. But I think this is really just a reflection of how a paradigm shift like this takes time. It takes researchers and NIH staff time to understand how to interpret what's written in the policy against what is happening in practice. And I think we as NIH can do a lot to help with that. I think we could update some of our policy materials based on the issues we're seeing. And of course, we're collaborating with the FDP to create a better data management and sharing plan template that will promote better answers. This is a summary of the issues we found in 2023, and we're still finding them now. Unfortunately, I think that original format page really encourages researchers to give us conflicting information in their plan. So that's something we're working on in the new template. We also identified issues associated with which data are generated and shared, when the data are shared, where it's shared, how it's shared, and whether a reason for not sharing, for limiting sharing, or for delaying sharing was justifiable. I'm not going to go over each bullet here right now because I'll spend most of the presentation giving you tips for how to avoid these issues. This is small, but I did just want to show a snapshot of that portfolio analysis of repositories that I was talking about. This gives us an NICHD-wide view of what repositories researchers are naming in their plans, and then we can take a look at, are these appropriate? What other patterns are occurring so that we can give better guidance? For example, you can see that GitHub is getting a lot of hits. But we actually don't want researchers using GitHub to share data. It's not. We love GitHub. It's great for sharing code and technical documentation, and we use it for that ourselves. But there's something called the desirable characteristics of data repositories that was published by both the White House and then replicated in the NIH policy materials. GitHub was just designed for something else, and we're looking for repositories that hit most of those desirable characteristics to share NIH data. And I'm going to hit on some of these other themes in my later slides. Overall tips, we often hear, just tell me what I should be thinking of in general. Remember that data management and sharing are inherent to research. We often hear this is an administrative burden, it has nothing to do with my research. No. Good data management and sharing is actually critical to good research. The whole point of this policy and the whole point of data sharing is to accelerate scientific progress. That is not just unique to NICHD. I should have made that clear. This is true NIH-wide. But data management sharing plans should be supporting that goal. When in doubt, refer to the definitions in the policy, because that's what we're looking to determine whether or not your plan is acceptable. And you can see on the right, the definition of data sharing is about making data accessible to the public and larger research community. And the definition of scientific data is tied to principles of quality and reuse regardless of publication. Be clear about which data, when, where, and how. This is not only for NIH's sake. We're going to make these plans public someday, and I'll tell you, the patient community cannot wait to see them. And it's important that they understand what researchers are going to do with the federal funds. And also, the better your plan is, the easier for you to implement it. Finally, for anything that deviates from what's expected in the policy, justify it. So think of all the guidance and the policy as do it this way unless you have a strong reason not to. And the policy calls these justifiable limitations. And this has turned out to be a really beautiful framework for us because this is where we can come in and work together to work through real and also not real issues on why you're not sharing your data. Maybe we can get together, oh, you're concerned about this. Turns out your repository has a process for that. So it's a really powerful tool. You just have to really surface what your reason is. Okay, now I'm going to go through each of those in a little bit more detail. So when talking about which data you are both generating and sharing, we really need to see details like what species or source is your data coming from, what formats are you generating and sharing, and the amount. And this is because these details impact whether the rest of your plan is appropriate. Does privacy even matter here? Probably not if it's a model organism. Is your repository appropriate? Do you need fancy software to access fancy files? And does the NIH genomic data sharing policy even apply? We're finding the same thing Heather found, which is we don't even have enough information about amounts and formats and species to even figure out how to apply that policy. It's important to be clear about the details for each data type generated, and I don't blame the researchers for this, I blame the format page, because we get a list of data types that are being generated, and then you talk about a bunch of stuff, and we can't tell which details map to each data type. So that's something we're talking about, promoting better structure for in the future. Unfortunately, we're still seeing a lot of plans that say they will only share data associated with publications. But remember, the policy expects sharing data regardless of publications, that definition of scientific data, again. So we should be seeing how you're going to share scientific data not associated with publications by the end of the award period as well. And this is important because it was built into that policy and that definition of scientific data from day one, but has been further emphasized by the White House's memo on ensuring free and equitable and immediate access to federally funded research and NIH's public access policy in response. Where to share your data and establish data repositories. And this is actually a really useful tool for you as the researchers as well. When you know where you're going to share your data, most of your data management sharing plan is completed for you because they will give you guidelines on how, what documentation to provide, what metadata, what de-identification methods. So the minute you get your award, you can actually get started on implementing your plan. Don't worry, if you need to change your data repository for whatever reason during your grant, you can do that with program officer approval. Make sure you're sharing data and data repositories that make the data accessible to the public or larger research community. Anybody know where that language came from? The definition of data sharing. So it's no longer acceptable to just share data within a consortium or within an institution because that's not the broader research community. Again, sharing data only via publication. So we've seen everything from, oh, my publication itself is the data, and I'm going to give some supplemental material when I publish. And this is not sufficient because, again, the policy doesn't care if you publish. You have to have a plan for sharing your scientific data regardless of publication. And journals and PubMed Central are actually not data repositories. Again, hearkening back to the desirable characteristics that the White House is looking for, journals are designed, PubMed is designed to do something different. So we really need to be seeing data sharing through repositories, and this is a place where some of the public policy materials could be clarified. In the repository analysis I showed you, we've also observed an over-reliance, is what I'm going to call it, on generalist repositories. So generalist data repositories are the systems that take anything, any format, whatever you have, they'll take it and they'll release it. But the policy actually expects that you prioritize domain or discipline or data type specific data repositories. And this is because those systems specialize in meeting the needs of their specific research community. They have specific services, specific features. Genomic data sharing repositories are an example of this. That really increases the value of the data. And we love our generalist repositories, things like Dryad, Dataverse, Zenodo, but they should really only be used if there's no other domain-specific data repository available. And of course, we're collaborating across NIH to make these systems better as well. Within NICHD, we built a tool called a Data Repository Finder. I'm mentioning it here because the goal of this tool for us was to create a list of data repositories that in general will take NICHD relevant data. And what we did was we surfaced these details that directly map to each element of the data management and sharing plan. If you use our tool or you don't use our tool, the key message here is look to your data repository to find out how to complete your data management and sharing plan. They have most of the information you need to know. You're going to need to do a little homework. Just because one of these systems appears on the BMIC list or the sharing.nih.gov list doesn't mean you're good to go. Sometimes we see NCI systems in our plans, but our researchers aren't going to get approval to use that data repository. So you really have to do a little homework to make sure you have a suitable repository, but then we made this tool to make it easier for you to complete your plan. Okay, the biggest issue we are still seeing in data management and sharing plans are researchers who propose sharing by request, or basically requiring that the researcher who generated that data approves any other researcher using and accessing that data. And this is we're calling it the old school method of sharing, but it really doesn't meet that definition of data sharing. And we know this because there's a growing body of literature demonstrating that, but also think of it, think of the common sense here. If one researcher or one small group of researchers is controlling access to a data set, we're not gonna get to the scale we're looking for here. Data repositories have hundreds and thousands of users. It is not a good use of your time to play gatekeeper to approve each of those. That's what repositories are for. But again, this might be our fault a little. We probably weren't clear enough. There is a difference between PI control like that and what NIH means by controlled access, which is described as a privacy protection in our policy materials. So when you're talking about human data, this does not apply to non-human data, you should think about things like de-identification. That's a good privacy protection. If you're still concerned about sensitivity and privacy of your data, that's when you think about controlled access data repositories, where it's the repository that has established processes for verifying appropriate use of the shared data. That's things like approving a data access request and getting end users to sign a data use agreement. And I think this community knows better than anyone else that when institutions or researchers sign one-to-one data use agreements, it can take years to get those signed. These data repositories, they've got this down. It takes 1 to 4 days, right, Emily, to get a data use agreement signed. We got it down in 1 day in a program we collaborate on. 1 to 4 days is what we're seeing in our systems. So no PI control. You don't need to get in the middle of this. The repositories will do it for you. Okay, so I'm trying to surface this theme of, for anything that deviates from what we expect, provide a justification. We discussed recently that in the data management and sharing plan template, we actually don't care anymore for you to tell us why you're sharing data. We already told you why. It's to accelerate scientific progress. It's only when you're not going to share, or you're not going to share in a repository, or you're not going to share by the end of the award period, that's when we need an essay as to why not. And this framework, is very powerful, but we also need details about this. If you say, I can't share for legal reasons, we're not going to just believe you. You have to cite what the law is. You have to explain the policy that is in play. You have to break down for us how these laws and policies are getting in the way of you sharing the data the way that NIH is expecting. In some cases, you even have to invoke specific protections. SBIR is an example of this. SBIR means you can delay your data sharing, but you don't have to. So if you're going to, you have to specifically invoke it in your plan. Similarly, with human subjects, we won't accept privacy issues and ethical issues as a reason to not share. Break down for us how you engage your IRB in making a determination about which data are too sensitive to share, or something like that, right? We really need to see a detailed analysis because being hand-wavy about this is not going to get us very far. I will also just briefly address the genomic data sharing policy. Here I tried to break it down for you basically to make the point that those of you who've been in the genomic data sharing business since 2014 are used to this framework. You're used to telling us which data, when, where, and how. Of course, under the data management sharing policy, we now expect the same information for all data types. And Heather is right, there's also still special rules to each of these for genomic data sharing, like which formats and data types to share. The timelines for human data are a little bit quicker. We do have special repositories for you to use. And I want to talk a bit about the how. So we got head nods earlier. Data submissions to these genomic data sharing policies are governed by the GDS institutional certification. And you all know that that document says, you can tell us the data use limitations on how other researchers can use these data, but it must be based on consent, right? So this is another example of perceived or not real limitations aren't going to fly anymore. It must be based on something real, like consent, like rules. And this language is actually from the 2003 policy. It is otherwise not appropriate for researchers to place limits on how the data are shared and used. And of course, this overall framework now applies to the overall policy. I wanted to surface some findings from the analysis of the budget justifications. Often they're missing. We couldn't find them. They weren't in your budget justifications with that header about data management and sharing. When they are there, they're not doing exactly what the SF 424 instructions say. We're not seeing that brief summary of the data sharing plan. We're not seeing how the activities map to these allowable costs for data management sharing categories align. And those three categories are curating and preparing data, repository fees, and special local data management. We see 0 or low budgets for many, even when there's an extremely robust and detailed data management sharing plan. We're hearing from our program officers, they just can't make sense out of these budgets. They can't see how the overall budget is going to support all the activities of the plan. Sometimes there's a disconnect between the personnel named in the plan and the personnel described in the budget request. We've seen examples where researchers are requesting a lot of money for data management, even when they're not sharing data at all. And we're not so sure this is justified because most local data management is actually still F&A and indirects. It's only when you are doing something really, really special that you should be putting it in directs under the auspices of data management and sharing. So if you're not sharing at all, I'm not so sure that's going to fly. On a positive note, we are seeing that most budgets, you're setting yourselves up to incur your costs during the award period. There's a risk, though, if you're not using a data management and sharing policy, data repository. And this is because if you're paying for your own storage costs on your own server or on a website or even in GitHub, those costs are going to bleed out beyond your award period. So our tips for data management and sharing budgets in general are all rooted in the fact that we want you to request the funds that you need to perform the activities that are described in your data management and sharing plan throughout the life of the project. Don't panic at the end and say you don't have enough money. This, we described that once you know your data repository, you can start preparing for sharing. And so we actually think that at NICHD at least, most of the costs are going to come down to personnel. Who is going to spend their time and effort getting those files ready to put the data in the data repository? You probably already have that person. They're probably the same person generating the data and analyzing the data. So use them for all of this as well. Collaborations with institutional librarians and DCCs, data coordinating centers, we encourage that maybe your data management and sharing costs are low because they're helping you. Why don't you tell us that so that we know? We know that those costs are coming from somewhere else. And again, I just want to emphasize this point that if you're not using a data repository, your costs are looking more expensive. Because if you are hosting on your own website or own server, you're paying those storage costs, and then you're going to end up wanting to take the data down because you're paying for those fees. When you submit data to a data repository, most NIH data repositories do not charge a submission fee at all. Some do, but it's a minimal one-time cost. So you pay that fee, and then it's up to the repository and their data retention cycles to share that data, often in perpetuity. We want this data to be shared as long as possible, and we don't want you to stop sharing just because you're paying for it, the copy on your local server. So let the data repository take care of that. We recently, so we do have NICHD policy, materials about the data management sharing policy. Again, these would apply to anybody. It's just based on the observations that we've uncovered within the Institute. And we recently did a round of updates on all of it based on everything that I just shared with you. And we are happy to share this NIH-wide. Thank you.
So we have a couple questions in the chat, and we'll take just a couple minutes to do a few questions for Valerie and Heather and Emily, to the extent that she's willing to help out. But we do want to make sure that we leave some time, too, to get your feedback on a couple things that we're thinking about for next steps. But I think the first question that's gotten a lot of votes, Heather, you mentioned that NCI found that about 75% of plans listed the PI as responsible for oversight. And are you cool with that?
It's a good question. I mean, yeah, it's a good question. I'll start with it. We don't really have a policy requirement for who is responsible for it. And I don't know if maybe, Michelle, if you even want to weigh on this question. You know, like I said, we were really looking at it just to have an understanding of, you know, what's coming next, because I think, you know, the biggest question, or one of the big questions that we get when we give these kinds of talks is, you know, well, what is oversight going to look like? And, you know, we don't really have a great, strong answer for that at this point, but we wanted to be prepared for that. So what are our applicants, you know, envisioning as far as responsibility for oversight?
You know, I agree. The one thing that we've heard is that folks wanted individuals named, and we just don't see a need for that. If it's whomever the institution deems appropriate, I think we have to go with that, and the policy doesn't say otherwise. Yeah.
I could comment on that as well. Yeah, we had a emotional conversation about this within our data sharing committee when we were first reviewing the policy together, because you know, our program officers said it's all about the PI, they're responsible. We just don't like seeing inconsistency. If you're also going to talk about a postdoc who's going to do the work, fine, just don't forget them in the budget. And we've also noticed recently that many of you, and maybe FDP is responsible for this, you are starting to use a standard statement that says a business office is responsible for. I don't have a problem with that. Sounds like Michelle doesn't. So, you know, that might be okay moving forward.
And if folks do have questions, you're more than welcome to come to the mic or enter the questions in the CVent app. If you have entered a question in the CVent app and we don't have time to get to it, because I'm realizing we got 15 minutes left before you really want to go hit the open bar, you know, please feel free to go ahead and enter, and then we'll make sure that either the comments or the questions or whatever get back to our NIH colleagues, and we can try to answer them later. But I see Lisa has come to the mic.
Hi, Lisa Mosley, Yale University. That statement about the business office being responsible for data management and sharing is actually a statement that's on the general generic NIH templates. So, you know, we try to catch it at proposal time because centrally we do not have the infrastructure set up to be responsible for all of the data management plans. We're amongst friends, right? Like nobody's going to come get us. But that's where that statement is coming from. So maybe that template can be modified to just remove that statement.
And I think the reason why it was done that way is just because, you know, the grant is made to the institution and the institution official signs off on it. So, I mean, if it's something that is causing heartburn, we can think about that. Yeah.
And then I think one other comment that I noticed in this event is maybe more a request versus a question. And I will say that Heather and Emily, we just got one of our first, JIT stage feedback on a DMS plan from NCI, and it walked very specifically through every section of the plan, every element of the plan, and it was like, this needs to be better, this was great, good job. And I was like, this is amazing, and I'm gonna like save this and share it with everyone so they can do a better job. So the more often that we can have program officers or GMS folks looping in the sponsored office, because our PI is going to take that feedback and do what he needs to do. But it's so valuable to us to be able to help you get a better DMS plan from the next PI from our institution that submits. The more often the grants office can get copied on those, the better, I think.
Oh, that's great. It looks like our tool is helping.
It was beautiful. I was like, this is perfect. All right, so
We have a question at the mic.
we got a question at the mic, and then we're going to move on.
Okay, so really quickly, Annie Pueblo, VCU. I saw that there was a recent notice about the questions that are going to be flowed out to the Ripper on data management and sharing. Can you give us any sneak peek on what we will see? And if you can't, that's okay, but just curious.
It's the RPPR, no sneak peek, but it will align with what we're trying to do. Okay, a sneak peek is. And it'll align with what we're trying to do with Charlie. That's a sneak peek, right?
Structure.
Yep.
I think I saw that the PRA notice was in the Federal Register yesterday, Michelle.
It probably is, yeah.
So progress.
Progress is progress.
All right, so you guys just heard Michelle talk about Charlie. And as we've talked about in phase 1 of the pilot, our goal wasn't necessarily to say, Alpha is it, and that's what we're going to do, or Bravo is it wholesale, right? It was to say, here are these 2 template options. There's a sample format page that's out. What of these works? You know, can we pull different elements and come up with a template at the end that's really going to work? So we're working with colleagues like Emily, Valerie, and Heather, and the other IC participants in the pilot to gather their feedback from what they're seeing. We, are going back to our survey data, and we're trying to come up with like what would that template look like that synthesizes all of the things that worked or all of the feedback that we got. We are working on creating sort of that next iteration, Charlie, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. Hopefully we'll get to a point where we've actually got something that we can plan some of these, like the roundtable discussions that we had early on, and really get some detailed feedback. But one of the things we wanted to do today was just spend a couple minutes asking a few questions about some of the things that we're thinking about as we're creating that next iteration. And I think also in this event app, so hopefully you all have your mobile devices that none of us ever leave home without. If you go into this event app, we do have a few polls, but we're also inviting any kind of general feedback that you might have to offer for us, either in the chat or the Q&A function in this event, or if you want to come up to the mics. On like 4 different elements that we're thinking about, and one of them is format. So we heard from both NCI and NICHD that sometimes certain elements were just forgotten. And we noticed that Bravo used this nice table format here, like this is what the Bravo table format looks like. And it's a really clear way to say, for each type of data that you're generating, you need to make sure that you cover all of these bases. And so what we're thinking is trying to retain that table format, perhaps slightly modified in the next iteration, and extend to other sections. Can we help folks make sure that they're including all of the necessary information by prompting them with very clear tables? So our first poll question, did you make it? It's launched. Is hey, would a table format be helpful? Is this a good idea? And so if folks can help us out with is free text the preferred choice? Are tables helpful, but maybe only in certain things? Do you love the table format? I love table format, me personally. Do you have other suggestions, other thoughts for us?
Survey says tables are helpful but should be limited so far. Votes are still coming in. Keep voting.
Yeah. We got 9 minutes left and 3 more other things that we want your feedback on. So I'm going to keep powering through, but please do go and fill out those polls, because that's going to be really helpful data for us to take back as we continue going through these conversations.
Oh, great.
Okay. Yeah. So in case anyone couldn't hear, Sarah was mentioning that we can keep these polls open even after the session. So if you want to think about it, if you want to ask your faculty and share some information with us, that would be really helpful. One of the other things that we've been thinking about is, how do we categorize data types? How can we standardize? Bravo used some of these drop-down menus. What's the right thing to put in those drop-down menus for a broad data type? And I'm not really sure which of our IC colleagues came up with this idea, but they had this wonderful idea of what about this BMIC subject area? There's 7 of these really broad subject areas. Could that be what we use to populate the drop-down menu? So we want to know what you all think. Are those subject areas a good representation? Are they good things to use to populate that drop-down menu? We give you yes, no, and sometimes. And then are there other types of categorizations for data that you would think would be helpful? And the poll is live on that. Oh, okay. So, but I also think like in the same place in the app where you would go to enter a question in the Q&A, the poll is like right underneath it or right next to it. So if you're going to the app and go to the session, same place you'd enter the Q&A. All right. We also heard about how there was some confusion related to the data sharing timeline. And so in the table that we're thinking about for Charlie, we're thinking about offering very specific fields and potentially some drop-down menus so that we're asking for, is there a timeline for submission to a repository? Because a lot of times folks don't realize that that could be different, right? You can submit to a repository to make sure that there aren't any problems with your data, that you're kind of cleaning your data and getting it ready, all along the project versus waiting to do all of that at the end. And that may be distinct then from the timeline on which you're going to release the data for secondary use, right? Say you've got a 3-year study and you're going to be collecting over that 3 years from 100 different subjects. You don't have to wait until the very end to upload all 100 subjects, but you could wait until the very end and until the data set is complete to release that data set for secondary use. And then we also want to be thinking about specifically asking the period of data preservation. Are you going to ask that the repository make the data available for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? And asking for those three very specific pieces of information. So we're wondering if asking for information on the submission and release times separately is meaningful, or are these things even really different things? For most people, are they basically the same thing? Or for a lot of folks, do they recognize that there is a difference sometimes? Do you have any other feedback on resources or ways that we could ask about timeline to get more quality information there? And then the 4th area is limitations on sharing. So we talked a little bit about how there are some issues in terms of description of limitations, but that there's really kind of a fundamental difference under the policy of I'm limited from sharing that data because it was a qualitative survey and it's impossible to de-identify. So I have to place limitations on sharing because, I can't adequately de-identify those subjects. I have to place limitations on sharing because I was collecting data with a tribal nation. And I, have to be giving consideration to, tribal sovereignty and, the things that they need. Versus the data set is enormous and I can't find a repository that will take it, right? There's really fundamental differences between those considerations. And one of the things that we're thinking about doing too is providing some really clear check boxes where, if you have to place limitations via a controlled access repository, that you could be very clearly providing that information in the template. And so we want to know what folks think. Is it appropriate to think of different categories of limitations, such as, you know, limitations that are placed for consent or privacy reasons versus other types of limitations? And I think that we heard at one point, too, a concern, I think this was during the data stewardship, of, you know, that push and pull with a program officer of, you know, not being 100% sure you could make certain data available, but still needing to maximize based on privacy consent. All right. So we got 2 minutes left. But these are some of the things that we're thinking about as we're trying to come up with Charlie. You know, we have some other next steps we're thinking of. We are still pursuing phase 2, and we're working on brainstorming with a small group. Jim was going to provide color commentary, and then he decided to sit down at a table instead of sitting up here with us. I think I put deodorant on this morning, so hopefully it's not because I smell.
He's asleep.
But one of the things that we wanted to do was really focus in the initial stages of that phase on, you know, what kind of things would we include in a cost or effort calculator to kind of tie back the budget and the budget justification with the actual planning for a plan, right? If you say you're going to do something in a plan, you really have to think about, well, how much of a person does it take for me to do that? What are the activities that I have to engage in? Do those things cost me money? Who am I going to have do those things? And thinking about a cost or an effort calculator as kind of going along with that. But I will say, this is our email address. We're going to leave the polls open, and we really want to hear from you guys, because the main goal of the pilot is to come up with a template that is going to work for our IC colleagues, is going to give them the information that they need, but is going to actually be usable by the research community and make sense and be user-friendly. So if you have any thoughts on those things, please let us know. And there's 1 minute left between you and the open bar. So I don't know if anyone has any other questions or thoughts that they would want to share. Or
I do. I want to thank our NIH program officials for coming. I am so delighted to have you guys here with us, and it's just a different model. And we're really excited that you're engaged in leading the way with this. So we look forward to continuing this. Thank you so much. Even through the budget process, the budget part of it, we're not letting you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
thank you so much.
From me and Kristen.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I think we are adjourned for the day.
Yep, it's 5 o'clock. It's 5 o'clock somewhere and also here.
Yeah, I'm gonna stay for it.
So amazing.